Alright, what's up YouTube? Welcome to my tutorial. This will be how to assemble the small swamp runner kit on the Predator 212cc engine. This video pretty much shows you step by step how to do everything, but I'll be in and out just narrating. So step 1, find the center of your transom, install the transom bracket. Okay, hand tighten the wing bolts and then use a big box wrench or the back of a crescent wrench to tighten them down. Once that's done, be sure to tighten down the jam nut towards the transom so that the wing bolts don't back out. Now remove the gimbal nut, washer, and cotter pin from the gimbal bracket. Use number 0, number 1, or number 2 grease and apply the grease to the gimbal, then insert the gimbal bracket into the transom bracket. Now install the washer and bolt to the gimbal and tighten. Be sure to insert the cotter pin and bend the tag ends to keep from losing the bolt and washer while on the water. Now decide whether you want your handle to be right-handed or left-handed. I'm installing mine right-handed in this video. Now there's two bolts that hold the handle to the gimbal bracket. Now only one of those bolts have a nippled end on it. Depending on how you want your handle oriented will depend on whether that nipple bolt is going to be in the front or the back. Now the handle itself at the base has some pre-drilled holes for you to set the handle at different angles. I'm setting mine straight up and down, and there's a pre-drill hole in the front for me to line up the handle that way. So that's what I'm doing. I'm putting the nipple bolt in the front, and the nipple will seat down into that pre-drilled hole. Now once I have that bolt tightened down nice and tight, there's a jam nut that also needs to be tightened down to the gimbal bracket. Now if you want your handle tilted to the right or to the left, there's some pre-drill holes on the back of the base of the handle at different angles. I'm not sure the degrees. And yeah, then your nipple bolt will be in the back. Line it up with one of those holes depending on what angle you want it to be set at, and let the nipple on that bolt seat down into one of those pre-drilled holes. Okay, now it's time to mount the engine onto the gimbal bracket. Your kit would have came with a bag of bolts, 8 bolts to be exact. Only 4 of those bolts will have a washer and a nut on them. Those are your engine mount bolts. Now I kind of skipped through this process. No point in posting all that video footage. It's pretty self-explanatory. Just be sure to put the bolt through the bottom and the washer and nut on top. Okay, now it's time to install the coupler shaft and coupler housing. If your engine is new and you're having to remove the plastic from the engine shaft like I am, be careful not to lose the keyway. Now it's time to install the coupler shaft, but first, before we do that, get your number 0, number 1, or number 2 grease and grease up your engine shaft. The coupler shaft's going to have a couple of set screws in it. Remove those set screws one at a time and put some Loctite on it. Reinsert the set screws into the coupler shaft just enough to where they're not going to fall out. Now that you got that done, line up the keyway on the engine shaft with the slot inside the coupler shaft and slide the coupler shaft onto the engine shaft. The coupler shaft should rest up against the engine. If you're having trouble getting it to go that far, you may have to pull your keyway on the engine shaft back just a little bit and it should slide right on. Now use your Allen key to tighten the set screws down. Now remove the coupler nut from the coupler shaft and use your number 0, number 1, or number 2 grease to grease the coupler shaft. Now it's time to install the coupler housing, but before you do that, you want to fill the inner section there 1/3 full of grease. Hello? Hello? Hey. Yeah, babe. Okay. Okay. I got you. All right, I got you. All right, love you. Bye. I think a little over 1/3. Yeah, that's about right. Okay, so now you want to slide the coupler housing onto the coupler shaft. Make sure the threads of the coupler shaft go through. There's a slide bearing inside the coupler housing. Make sure those threads go through the race. If you notice, the coupler housing isn't mounting flush against the engine, and that's because of that slide bearing in there. What I'm doing right now is installing the coupler nut onto the threads of the coupler shaft, just to kind of pull it tight closer to the engine. It helps slide that slide bearing back a little bit. You can only pretty much go hand tight until you start turning the engine. So installing this coupler nut is something you can do before or after mounting the coupler housing. It doesn't matter. This is about as far as I can get it with the coupler nut. So once you install the mounting bolts, it will pull that coupler housing flush against the engine. When installing the coupler housing mounting bolts, Be sure to put some anti-seize on the bolts. When tightening down the coupler housing mounting bolts, crisscross tighten them a little bit at a time so that you push that slide bearing back and that the coupler housing can evenly and uniformly sit flush against the engine. Once it is flush against the engine, then you want to torque the bolts down to spec. No, I don't have a torque wrench. If you're mechanically inclined, you know the difference between not tight enough and too tight. Remember, the coupler nut only has to be hand tight. Engine operation will tighten the nut further. Now it's time to install the throttle cable. If you look at the throttle lever and the grip, there's a pattern on it. Just make sure you line those patterns up, snap them together, and slide it onto the handle. Once you get it on the handle, you'll want to figure out the most comfortable position for when you're driving the boat, where you want the handle to be. You can have the handle on top, you can have it on the bottom, or as I'm doing here, kind of a little off to the side is where I mounted mine. Now tighten the lever down with your Allen key. Remove the throttle cable from its housing. You're going to want to lubricate this cable. I used silicone spray, but I guess any lubricant would be fine. There's two pocket style holes drilled into the handle. There's one on top and one on bottom. Since I'm mounting my throttle lever on the bottom, I'm using the bottom hole to run the throttle cable housing through the handle. Run it through the handle until it comes out of the back. Feed it through almost all the way because it's eventually going to be mounted at the throttle lever. The two ends to the throttle cable, one end's a tag end, the other end kind of has a hammer head to it. There's some slots in the throttle lever where you can run the line, and that hammer head sits in a pocket right behind the trigger. Once you get your throttle cable in the throttle lever, screw down that jam nut. Okay, right now I'm just lubricating the first 12 to 15 inches or so of the throttle cable, just so I can get it started feeding it through the throttle cable housing. Once you get it started, go ahead and lubricate your throttle cable and feed it the rest of the way through. Once you get it fed through, then take the throttle cable housing and shove it into the jam nut. Now remove your air filter box by removing the two front, I believe it's 10 millimeter nuts. You'll also have to remove the two breather hoses. This engine comes with two different spots on the throttle linkages to mount throttle cables. I'm using the one on the far outside. I think it would look tacky if I came across the front and used that one. So anyway, you want to loosen that screw. It's just basically holding a clamp. That's what's going to clamp down on the throttle cable housing. And then the tag end of the throttle cable is going to go through a 10 millimeter nut that has a hole in it. You have to loosen that screw as well. Now this throttle cable and housing is extra long for this application. I guess if you wanted to, you could cut it and shorten it to length. I didn't want to do that, so what I did was just ran it around the handle and the gimbal bracket to just take some slack out of it. The throttle cable housing has a boot at the end of it. You'll see here that I tightened down that clamp on the throttle cable housing itself and not the boot. I later changed this and clamped or screwed the clamp down on the boot instead of behind it. You'll need a 10mm wrench, or in this case a crescent wrench, to hold that 10mm nut to loosen the screw. Once you do that, feed the throttle cable through the hole in the nut and take some needle nose pliers to pull it tight so that you can tighten the screw. Just enough to hold the cable in place. Then you'll need to hold the nut with the wrench while you tighten the screw so that you don't spin and strip your throttle cable like I almost did. Use a 10mm socket to loosen the tension nut on the throttle linkage. Don't loosen it too much. If you do, just tighten it down enough to where when you pull the throttle, it'll spring back freely. Take some wire cutters and shorten the tag end of the throttle cable. Now reinstall the air filter box. Don't forget to reinstall the breather hoses. Time to install the kill switch. Now the kill switch has two wires, one long one and one short one. The long one is going to get hooked up to your oil filter shut-off sensor, and the short wire is going to be your ground. Position the kill switch where you want it on the handle. I played with it a little bit and I found that just underneath the handle was perfect for me. Since I did mount the kill switch on the bottom as well, I had to wrap the wires on top and feed them through the pocket style hole that's drilled in the top of the handle. Now feed both wires through that pocket hole out the back of the handle. Splice the short wire, which is the ground wire, and add a bolt wire connector to the end. Now you can mount the ground wire to an engine mount or pretty much anywhere on the head. I found this screw on the heat plate that was connected to the engine head, and I decided to mount my ground wire there. Take some needle nose pliers or a screwdriver and unclip the black box that's holding all the wires on the low oil shutoff sensor. Hello. Hey. Hey. Uh-huh. Right. Right. Yeah. It's about to start. I'm literally getting sprinkled on right now, babe. Love you, bye. Disconnect the yellow wire clips, and then cut the upper yellow wire somewhere in the middle. You want to leave yourself some room, because you're going to have to splice those two wires and splice the kill switch wire, and connect those together. I happen to use a wire nut to connect mine. Some people might use some clips like you see that's already there, or maybe even some heat shrink wrap if you have some. Now the long wire coming from the kill switch, it's pretty long. You can shorten it to length if you like. I personally don't like shortening wires unless I have to, because if you ever need to make any changes in the future and you cut off all your slack, then you just have to add more wire. So I just kind of wrapped it around the gimbal bracket to where it wouldn't be impeding any of my operations while I'm driving. And then spliced the end and connected it to the two yellow wires that I cut. Now reconnect the male and female wire connectors, yellow wire connectors, back together. Should be it. Now position the wire connectors back in the black clip and snap it closed. Water getting in there. I'll put some heat shrink wrap on there just to be sure. Now that the kill switch is all hooked up and installed, I want to test it out. But before we do that, we gotta fill this engine with oil and gas because it's new. Sprinkling. Alright, we're going to run it, and then we're going to test out the... Alright, now I got to test out the kill switch. Make sure everything's wired up right. It's heavy. This was probably the most difficult part for me, was installing this shaft. It didn't have to be. You have to slide the outer shaft into the coupler housing, and you know, it's tight. The coupler housing, you'll see, has a split in it, and then you put the wing nuts in to tighten it down onto the outer shaft. But it's tight. I mean, you have to twist and push and twist and push to get it in there. And I got it in there, I thought, as far as it'd go, and it still wasn't far enough. So I took a rubber mallet and tried hammering at the very tip of the skag, but that was basically just putting downward force onto it. That noise you're hearing right now is the play in the inner shaft, and you don't want any play back there. So the shaft still needs to get pushed further into the engine. Now you'll see here with the engine off, I'm pulling it just to see if the inner shaft spins, and it does, which means the inner shaft is connected to the coupler nut. But with that play, it's not connected all the way. What I had to do was place a piece of 2x4 at the top of the skag, just underneath the outer shaft,
That's 6.5.
hit it with a rubber mallet, and it went right in. Took all that play right out of the back there.
6.25.
Now, if I would have just done that from the beginning, I would have had that shaft installed in, less than a minute. But instead, I fought and pushed and prodded and about threw my back out trying to shove that thing in there by hand. So don't make that mistake. Get you a piece of 2x4 and right there above the skag, where the skag meets the outer shaft at the top of the skag, and just hit it with a rubber mallet, and it'll slide that outer shaft right into that coupler housing. Whatever you do, do not hit the end of the inner shaft, the prop nut. That's not going to do anything. It'll push that shaft up into the coupler nut, but the play won't. You can't get the play out without pushing the outer shaft into that coupler housing.
Just forgot to put some Loctite on here. I don't want this falling off in the water, even though there is a lock washer on there. Put some of this on there.
And FYI, don't forget to put your wing bolts in your coupler housing after you get your shaft installed, like I did. Not that mine was going anywhere. It was in there pretty tight. Just make sure you hand tighten them down, and then use a box wrench or the back of a crescent wrench to torque them down. Don't over tighten them, but don't under tighten them either. You want them tight though. Get them tight, but not so tight you're going to break the wings off of those wing bolts. The very last thing you have to do is grease up your Zerk fittings, and you're ready to ride. Stay tuned. At the end of this video, I do a speed test on the water. Thanks for watching.